This is the chemistry and effects of dye. Here are some picture examples of liquid and powder form dyes. What is dye? Well, a dye is a colored substance that chemically bonds to the substrate to which it is being applied. It distinguishes dyes from pigments which do not chemically bind to the material they are coloring. Dye is generally applied in an aqueous solution and may require a mordant, which is a substance, typically in an inorganic oxide, to improve the fastness of the dye on the fiber. Different types of dye I'm going to be talking about are food dye, hair dye, and fabric dye. Synthetic versus natural dyes. Synthetic dyes are chemically manufactured, but synthetic colors allowed manufacturers and dye houses to operate in large quantities and offer vivid, rich colors. They stick to fabrics easily, don't lose pigmentation, and offer a large palette of color options. Because of this, people usually like synthetic dyes better. Natural dyes are purely developed from nature. So some people can see natural dyes as better because of the fact that they don't have chemicals in them like synthetic dyes do. They're healthier and technically more reliable, but natural dyes are still less favored. The chemicals in hair dye. The chemicals found in hair dye are hydrogen peroxide, PPD, resorcinol, and aminophenol. Hair dye is made of many different chemical things we call compounds. Most permanent hair dyes use three components, which are ammonia, hydrogen peroxide, and p-phenylenediamine. The chemicals in food dye. The chemicals found in food dye are carotenoids, chlorophyll, anthocyanin, and turmeric. This diagram shows blue and red dye. It shows how they're transmitted with light and affect the color wheel. This red dye has an orange absorbed light, which is a complementary color to the blue. The red gives green absorbed light, and that's a complementary color to red. The chemicals in fabric dye. The chemicals found in fabric dye are soda ash, hydrochloric, hydrogen peroxide, sulfuric acid, acetic acid, formic acid, and caustic acid. Molecular formulas. All the dyes have different molecular formulas, and what it is a formula giving the number of atoms of each of the elements present in one molecule of a specific compound. Here's an example of the molecular formula for azo dye. Azo dye is only found in fabric dye, and that is an example, which is the chemical equation for it. Different forms of dyes. The main 6 different types of dyes are liquid, tablets, powder, cakes, cones, or donuts. Things people use dyes for. People use dyes for a variety of things like cosmetic and pharmaceutical products, food, Easter eggs, hair, textiles, paper, leather, and other materials like those. Here are some example videos of people doing things like dyeing the hair pink or a type of dye being put in and dyeing the water. Are hair dyes bad for you? Well, hair dye does have some toxic chemicals. PPD is a toxic chemical because it can link to skin irritation and birth defects. Toluene can be linked to neurotoxicity, birth defects, or even pregnancy loss. Resorcinol is linked to endocrine disruption, and lead acetate is linked to neurotoxicity. Hair dye has some very harmful chemicals that can cause itching or rashes if you're allergic, but very little amounts will end up getting in your bloodstream. Are food dyes bad for you? Well, most people won't be heavily affected by food dye. It should be avoided, however, because food dye is found in many unhealthy processed foods and can have negative effects on your mood, even if they aren't extreme. But food dye can be linked to cancer, ADHD, allergies, hypersensitivity, asthma, and hyperactivity. Red dye 40. Red dye 40 is the most specific food dye to have the worst effects. There are various articles that can suggest red dye 40 is bad for kids who have ADHD. It can affect their behaviors, causing hyperactivity and neurobehavioral effects. Red dye 40 has been linked to aggression as well. Red dye 40 is the only thing with an effect, but it is the main one. It's a chemical compound that comes from coal tars. Dyes made from coal tars are created by mixing various fragrant-smelling hydrocarbons like benzene and toluene. Research has linked red dye 40 with cancer and has associated it with allergies and hyperactivity and irritability. Here's an image showing the effects on the brain after red dye 40 exposure. Are fabric dyes bad for you? Fabric dyes can be bad for you, and a main one is azo dyes, which was mentioned earlier. Decomposed azo dye has proved that it can cause cancer in humans. Bladder, kidney, and liver cancer are the usual results of long-term exposure to degraded azo dye remnants. The textile dyes, along with a larger number of industrial pollutants, are highly toxic and potentially carcinogenic, that they are related to the environmental degradation and various diseases in animals and humans. Acid dyes. An acid dye is a dye that is typically applied to a textile at low pH. They are mainly used to dye wool, not cotton fabrics. Some acid dyes are used as food colorants, and some can also be used to stain organelles in the medical field. Acid dyes sound scary to people in some ways because of the word acid. These dyes are actually non-caustic, and in some cases, non-toxic, and are named for the mild acid, such as vinegar, used in the dyeing process, and for the types of bonds they form to fiber. Acid dye types. Acid dyes are thought to fix to fibers by hydrogen bonding and ionic bonding. The structure of the acid dye molecules fall into four main categories: azo, anthraquinone, premetallized, and triphenylmethane. Here is 3 pictures that show examples of different acid dye types with different colors: acid blue 78, acid blue 45, and acid yellow 23. Here's some images that show different color types like sunflower bond and copper shimmer for hair, or blue 1 and green 3 like in artificial dye colorings. As you can see, there are endless shades of dyes for most things, especially in beauty products. The colors all have many different shades.